They tore Obese girl's dress at the church dance. Mountain Man's gift made her the belle of night. Spring 1825 arrived at Fort Laramie with the softness of melting snow and the promise of wildflowers pushing through the thawing earth. Prudence Miller sat by the window of her family's modest quarters, her needle pulling thread through the pale linen she'd been saving for 3 long years. Each stitch was a prayer, each seam a whispered hope that this year would be different. The annual spring dance at the fort's timber church was only a week away, and for the first time in her 22 years, Prudence had decided she would attend. Not to watch from the shadows as she'd done twice before, but to actually dance, to wear a dress she'd made with her own capable hands, to feel, perhaps just for one evening, like she belonged. Her mother, Greta, a sturdy German immigrant who'd married a fur trader and journeyed west with dreams of adventure, looked up from her bread-making. "It's beautiful, Liebling," she said, flour dusting her round cheeks. "You have your grandmother's gift with a needle." Prudence smiled, though her heart carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of sidelong glances and whispered cruelties. She'd inherited her mother's build, what her father kindly called substantial, and what the Fort Society women called unfortunate. The officers' daughters, raised on notions of delicate femininity imported from Boston and Philadelphia, had made Prudence's childhood a series of small humiliations. Sarah Wickham, Colonel Wickham's willowy daughter, led the pack with the particular viciousness of the beautiful who'd never known want or exclusion. "Will you truly go?" her mother asked, kneading the dough with practiced hands. "I will," Prudence said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I'm tired of hiding, Mama. I'm tired of being invisible." What Prudence didn't say, what she barely admitted to herself, was that she'd seen Nathaniel Blackwood watching her. The mountain man came to the fort 4 times a year to trade his furs, and each time she'd caught him looking at her with something she couldn't quite name in his storm-gray eyes. He was a solitary figure, dressed in buckskins weathered by wind and wilderness, his dark hair long and tied with a leather cord. The fort's gossip said he'd lost his family to cholera 5 years back and had taken to the mountains to escape his grief. Prudence had never spoken to him. She barely spoke to anyone outside her immediate family, but she'd watched him work leather with hands that seemed to coax beauty from raw hide. His buckskin goods were the finest anyone had seen, supple as silk and decorated with intricate beadwork he claimed to have learned from the Shoshone and Crow tribes he traded with. The week passed in a blur of final stitches and secret fittings. The dress was simple. Prudence had neither the money nor the audacity for anything elaborate, but it was hers, cut to fit her body without apology. On the evening of the dance, as the spring sun painted Fort Laramie in shades of amber and rose, Prudence carefully packed the dress in a cloth bag and made her way to the church. The timber structure stood at the heart of the fort, its bell tower visible for miles across the plains. Inside, the women's changing room was already crowded with officers' daughters in gowns shipped from the east at considerable expense. Prudence found a quiet corner and hung her dress on a peg, trying to ignore the sudden silence that fell when she entered. "Well, well," Sarah Wickham's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Prudence Miller has decided to grace us with her presence. How brave." Laughter rippled through the room. Prudence kept her eyes down, her fingers trembling as she smoothed the dress on its peg. "That dress is quite practical," another girl said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Very German." More laughter. Prudence felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to respond. She'd promised herself she wouldn't let them ruin this night. "I need some air," she murmured, and fled outside to where the men were gathering, her eyes stinging with the effort of holding back tears. She stood in the lengthening shadows for perhaps 20 minutes, breathing in the cool evening air scented with pine and sage. When she returned to the changing room, her heart plummeted. The dress lay on the floor, torn from neckline to hem. Black ink, someone had spilled an entire bottle, covered the bodice in ugly spreading stains. The careful stitches she'd spent months on were ripped apart, the fabric destroyed beyond any hope of repair. "Oh!" Sarah's voice was bright with manufactured surprise. "Prudence, I'm so sorry. My hand slipped when I was reaching for my shawl. What terrible luck." The other girls clustered around Sarah, their faces masks of false sympathy that barely concealed their glee. One of them, Margaret something, Prudence could never remember her last name, even had the audacity to press a handkerchief to her lips as if stifling genuine distress. "Such a shame," Margaret said, "and you worked so hard on it. Perhaps next year?" They swept out of the room in a rustle of silk and self-satisfaction, leaving Prudence alone with the ruins of her dreams. She sank to the floor, gathering the destroyed dress in her arms, and finally let the tears come. They weren't just for the dress, though that loss cut deep, but for every casual cruelty she'd endured, every moment she'd been made to feel less than human because her body didn't conform to some arbitrary standard of acceptability. "I hate them," she whispered to the empty room. "God forgive me, but I hate them." Dina and Nathaniel Blackwood had come to Fort Laramie 3 days early this spring, driven by a restlessness he couldn't quite name. He told himself it was business. He needed to finalize a large order with the fort's quartermaster. But in the quiet moments before sleep claimed him in his rented quarters, he admitted the truth. He'd come early hoping to catch another glimpse of the German trader's daughter, the one with the capable hands and sad eyes who watched the world with a wariness that matched his own. He'd noticed her 2 years ago when she had helped her father unload a wagon of supplies, working with an efficiency and strength that put the nearby soldiers to shame. She hadn't seen him watching, had no idea that he'd return to the fort more frequently than his trade truly required, always hoping for another glimpse. Nathaniel wasn't a man prone to fancy. The mountains had taught him practicality, and grief had taught him caution. But something about Prudence Miller had worked its way under his skin like a burr, refusing to be dislodged. He admired the set of her shoulders when she thought no one was watching, the way she moved through the world with quiet dignity, despite the obvious disdain of the fort's so-called society. On the evening of the dance, he had been checking on his horse in the stable when he heard it, the sound of someone crying with the kind of broken-hearted desperation that spoke of something more than mere disappointment. He followed the sound to the church's side entrance, where the women's changing room was located. Protocol said he should walk away. A man didn't intrude on women's spaces, didn't insert himself into their private griefs. But something about those sobs, the raw pain in them, kept his feet rooted. "Miss," he called softly through the door, "are you hurt? Do you need help?" The crying stopped abruptly. A moment of silence stretched, then, "Please go away." He recognized the voice, Prudence Miller. "Can't do that," he said, surprising himself. "Not until I know you're all right." Another pause, then the door cracked open. Prudence's face appeared, eyes red and swollen, cheeks tracked with tears. In her arms she clutched what looked like a ruined dress, ink-stained and torn. "I'm fine," she said, though clearly she wasn't. It doesn't matter. Please forget you saw me." Nathaniel looked at the destroyed dress, then at the determination trying to reassemble itself in her expression, and something in his chest cracked open. He knew rejection. He knew what it was to have happiness snatched away by casual cruelty. He'd sworn after losing his wife and daughter that he'd never risk his heart again, but this wasn't about hearts or risk. This was about simple human decency. "Who did this?" he asked quietly. Prudence's laugh was bitter. "Does it matter? It's done. I'm going home." Give me an hour," Nathaniel said suddenly, the plan forming even as he spoke. 1 hour. Don't leave." "Mr. Blackwood." "Nathaniel, and I mean it. Wait here. I promise you won't regret it." He didn't wait for her answer, just turned and ran for the stables, his mind already racing. He had in his cabin the most beautiful piece of doe skin he'd ever tanned, white as fresh snow, supple as water, decorated with natural patterns from the deer's life. He'd been saving it for something special, though he'd never quite admitted to himself what that something might be. His horse, a gray mare named Storm, seemed to sense his urgency and flew across the darkening plains toward his cabin 3 miles from the fort. Nathaniel burst through his door, grabbed the rolled doe skin from its place of honor, and was back in the saddle within minutes. But the dress would need more than just material. It would need someone who could work miracles with needle and thread, and work them fast. There was only one person at Fort Laramie with that kind of skill. Willow of the Shoshone had married a French-Canadian trapper, and now lived at the fort's edge, her tiny cabin a place where East met West in the most practical ways. She was known for her beadwork and her ability to blend native designs with European sensibilities. More importantly, she was kind, and kind was exactly what this situation needed. He pounded on her door. "Willow, I need your help, urgently." The door opened to reveal a small woman with black hair threaded with silver and eyes that missed nothing. "Nathaniel Blackwood, you look like a man possessed. I need a dress, the most beautiful dress you've ever made, in less than an hour." To his eternal gratitude, Willow didn't laugh or question. She simply looked at the doe skin he held, then at his face, and nodded. "Tell me the story while I work, and tell me her size." Prudence sat in the empty changing room, hugging her knees to her chest, wondering why she'd agreed to wait. Nathaniel Blackwood had seemed so certain, but what could he possibly do? A dress was a dress, and hers was destroyed. No amount of frontier resourcefulness could undo that. She should go home. She should gather her dignity in her ruined dress and walk back to her family's quarters and forget this whole humiliating episode. Next year she could try again, or perhaps she'd finally accept that some dreams weren't meant for people like her. But she didn't move. Something in Nathaniel's storm-gray eyes had held a promise she couldn't quite dismiss. So she waited, listening to the sounds of the gathering dance, musicians tuning their instruments, the low rumble of male conversation, the bright chatter of women who belonged. Exactly 53 minutes after Nathaniel had left, the door opened again. He stood there with a bundle wrapped in clean cotton cloth, his face flushed from running, his hair disheveled. "I kept my promise," he said simply, and held out the bundle. Prudence stood on shaking legs and took it, unwrapping the cloth with trembling fingers. What emerged made her gasp. The dress was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Made from white doe skin so soft it felt like clouds, it featured a simple but elegant cut that would drape rather than constrain. The neckline was modest but flattering, decorated with intricate beadwork in blues and greens that caught the lamplight. Delicate fringe adorned the sleeves and hem, interspersed with small feathers that gave the whole garment an air of something wild and free. It was part native craftsmanship, part European styling, and entirely breathtaking. "I can't," Prudence whispered. "This is too fine. This is too much." "It's yours," Nathaniel said firmly. "Willow, Mrs. Baptiste, helped with the sewing. She's waiting outside if you need help with the fit. We guessed at the measurements, but—" "It's perfect," Prudence interrupted, holding the dress against herself. Even without trying it on, she could tell it would fit, not the apologetic fit of most dresses made for her, always slightly wrong, always a compromise, but a real fit, made for her body as it actually was. Tears threatened again, but these were different. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for me?" Nathaniel's expression softened. "Because I've watched you work your father's wagon. I've seen you gentle spooked horses and carry 100-pound flour sacks without complaint. I've noticed you slip extra food to the fort's stray dogs and help Mrs. Chen with her English lessons. You're strong and kind and capable, and those girls who did this," he gestured at her ruined dress, "they're none of those things. Beauty comes in all forms, Miss Miller. It's about time someone reminded you of that." Before Prudence could respond, a soft knock came at the door. "I'm Willow," a gentle voice said. "May I help you dress? The dance has already started, and I think you should make an entrance." What followed was a blur of motion and quiet encouragement. Willow helped Prudence out of her day dress and into the doeskin creation, her hands quick and sure, as she made tiny adjustments with a needle and thread she'd brought for just such purpose. She unpinned Prudence's hair and rearranged it, weaving in small white feathers to match the dress. "You look like a queen," Willow said finally, stepping back to admire her work. "Like one of the warrior women from the old stories, strong and beautiful and ready to conquer the world." Prudence looked at herself in the small mirror someone had hung on the wall and barely recognized the woman looking back. The dress transformed her, not by hiding her body but by celebrating it. The doeskin draped her curves in ways that made them look intentional, powerful even. The beadwork drew the eye to the craftsmanship rather than her size. The overall effect was striking, unique, and undeniably beautiful. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll save me the first dance," Nathaniel said from outside the door, where he'd been waiting with careful propriety, "and maybe the second, and possibly all the rest." The church hall had been transformed. Candles burned in every sconce, casting warm light across the rough-hewn walls. Someone had brought in wildflowers, early prairie roses and wild irises that filled the space with the scent of spring. The musicians, 3 fiddlers, and a man with a squeeze box were already playing, and several couples moved across the floor in the pattern of a reel. Prudence stood at the entrance with Nathaniel beside her, suddenly paralyzed. Every eye in the room had turned toward them, and the music had stumbled to a halt. A silence fell, heavy and expectant. Sarah Wickham stood near the punch bowl in a dress of yellow silk that had probably cost more than Prudence's father made in 6 months. Her mouth had fallen open in a most unladylike expression of shock. Around her, the other girls who'd destroyed Prudence's dress wore similar expressions of disbelief. Colonel Wickham, Sarah's father, was the first to break the silence. "My word," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "That's the finest doeskin work I've ever seen. Miss Miller, you look absolutely magnificent." The spell broke. Suddenly everyone was talking at once, and the general sentiment seemed to be admiration rather than mockery. Major Harrison's wife, a kind woman from Virginia, hurried over. "Prudence, dear, you must tell me where you got that dress. I've never seen anything like it. The craftsmanship is extraordinary." "I made it," Willow said quietly, appearing at Prudence's elbow. "With Nathaniel's help. The doeskin is his, the finest tanning I've ever seen. The design is a blend of my people's tradition and European styling." "It's a masterpiece," Mrs. Harrison declared. "Absolutely a masterpiece." Nathaniel cleared his throat. The musicians seemed to be waiting. "Miss Miller, would you do me the honor?" Prudence let him lead her to the floor, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. She'd never danced in public before, had only practiced alone in her room to music she hummed herself. But Nathaniel's hand was steady at her waist, and something about the way he looked at her made her feel safe. The music started again, a waltz this time, slower and more intimate than the reel had been. Nathaniel proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her with gentle pressure and quiet confidence. Around them, other couples resumed dancing, but Prudence barely noticed them. She was caught in the moment, the feel of the soft doeskin against her skin, the warmth of Nathaniel's hand, the way the candlelight made everything seem golden and possible. "You're a natural," Nathaniel murmured as they turned. "Though I shouldn't be surprised. You do everything well." "You barely know me," Prudence protested, but she was smiling. "I know enough. I know you're strong enough to help your father, but gentle enough to comfort crying children. I know you're patient. I watched you teach young Tommy Robinson his letters last summer when his parents despaired of him ever learning. I know you love these mountains as much as I do because I've seen you watching them at sunset, with that look people get when they're seeing something that feeds their soul." Prudence stumbled slightly, caught off guard by the revelation that Nathaniel had been watching her as carefully as she'd been watching him. "You noticed all that?" "I notice you," he said simply. "Have been for 2 years now. Worked up the courage to talk to you about a dozen times and lost my nerve a dozen times. Figured tonight was as good a time as any to stop being a coward." Before Prudence could respond, the dance ended, and another gentleman, Lieutenant Morrison, a decent man who'd always been polite to her, appeared at her elbow with a bow. "Might I have the next dance, Miss Miller? I've been hoping for an opportunity all evening." What followed was extraordinary. Dance after dance, man after man approached her, not out of pity or obligation, but with genuine admiration. She danced with officers and traders, with craftsmen, and even with the fort's doctor, who told her his wife would love to commission a dress like hers. Across the room, Sarah Wickham and her coterie of mean girls stood in a tight knot, their expressions ranging from bewildered to furious. Colonel Wickham, having witnessed the earlier scene with the ruined dress, he'd passed by the changing room just as his daughter and her friends were leaving, their guilty faces confirming his suspicions, was currently giving Sarah what appeared to be a severe dressing down. One by one, the girls were collected by their mortified parents and marched from the hall. But Prudence barely noticed their departure. She was too busy experiencing something she'd never imagined possible, the feeling of being celebrated rather than tolerated, of being seen as beautiful rather than unfortunate, of belonging. When Nathaniel claimed her for the final dance of the evening, a slow waltz played as midnight approached, Prudence felt like she was floating. The doe-skin dress swirled around her legs, the beadwork catching the candlelight, and for the first time in her life, she felt beautiful. Not despite her body, but inclusive of it. The dress had been made for her as she was, and it transformed her not by changing her, but by celebrating her. "Thank you," she whispered to Nathaniel as they swayed together, "for everything, for seeing me, for the dress, for making tonight perfect." "The night's not over yet," Nathaniel said. "Walk with me? There's something I need to say, and I'd rather say it under the stars than in this crowded room." They walked through the fort's gates, properly accompanied by Willow at a discreet distance, because even frontier propriety had its standards, and found a spot on a small rise overlooking the plains. The spring night was cool but not cold, and the sky was ablaze with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Nathaniel said, "I lost my wife and daughter 5 years ago. Cholera during the big outbreak. Emma was 23, and our daughter Sarah, named for my mother, was barely 2. They died within days of each other, and I broke." Prudence reached out and took his hand, saying nothing, just offering silent comfort. "I went to the mountains to die," Nathaniel continued, his voice rough. "Figured if I pushed deep enough into the wilderness, took enough risks, something would eventually kill me and I'd be with them again. But the mountains don't work that way. They either kill you quick or they teach you to live. Turns out I'm a survivor despite myself." He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting starlight. "I learned leatherwork from a Crow medicine man who found me half frozen one winter and nursed me back to health. He taught me that beauty comes from accepting the nature of things, that the best leather isn't the stiffest or the most processed, but the piece that's been worked with respect for what it is. That perfection isn't about conforming to some external standard, but about being exactly what you're meant to be." "Is there a point to this story?" Prudence asked gently, though she thought she understood. "The point is that I learned to see beauty in things the world overlooks, in weathered leather and mountain storms and wildflowers that bloom in impossible places, in capable hands and kind hearts and women who carry the weight of other people's cruelty without letting it make them cruel in return." He squeezed her hand. "The point is that I've been half in love with you for 2 years, but I was too broken and too scared to do anything about it until I heard you crying tonight and realized that fear of loss is no excuse for failing to live. Prudence's breath caught. Nathaniel, I know I'm nobody, he rushed on, just a mountain man who barely makes enough to survive. I know you deserve someone with prospects and polish, but I also know that life's too short to pretend we don't feel what we feel. So I'm asking, hoping, that maybe you might consider letting me court you properly, slow and respectful, giving us time to know each other beyond this one magical night. Nobody? Prudence repeated, finding her voice. You think you're nobody? You're the man who saved my evening, who saw me when I felt invisible, who gave me not just a dress but dignity when mine had been shredded. She stepped closer, bold in the darkness and the wonder of the night. And you're wrong about one thing. I don't deserve someone better. I deserve someone exactly like you, someone who sees people as they are and finds them worthy. Is that a yes? Nathaniel asked, hope brightening his voice. That's a yes, Prudence confirmed, and found herself pulled into an embrace that felt like coming home. Behind them, Willow made a small sound of satisfaction and quietly retreated, giving them privacy for their first kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise under the endless Wyoming sky. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Fort Laramie had seen. Nathaniel, having finally admitted his feelings, proved to be attentive without being smothering, romantic without being foolish. He brought Prudence gifts from the mountains, unusual stones and dried flowers, sketches of landscapes he thought she'd appreciate. In return, she taught him to read better. He knew his letters but had never had much formal education, and shared her knowledge of plants and herbs learned from her German grandmother. But more than that, they worked together. Nathaniel had been right about their shared passion for leatherwork. Prudence had an artist's eye for design and a practical understanding of how garments needed to move and function. Nathaniel had the technical skill and the connections with native craftspeople. Together, they began creating pieces that drew admirers from across the frontier. Mrs. Harrison's commission for a doe-skin dress led to another and another. Word spread about the unique creations, dresses that celebrated women's bodies rather than constraining them, that blended European elegance with native artistry, that were both beautiful and practical for frontier life. Within 6 months, Nathaniel and Prudence had established a small workshop at the edge of the fort, with Willow as their partner and head seamstress. But success brought complications. Sarah Wickham, having been sent east to stay with relatives after her cruelty had become too public to ignore, had written letters to her former friends poisoning them against Prudence. Some of the fort society women began whispering that the workshop was improper, that Prudence was taking advantage of Nathaniel, that the whole enterprise was somehow scandalous. The breaking point came 8 months after the dance. A wealthy merchant's wife from St. Louis had commissioned 3 dresses and traveled to Fort Laramie specifically to collect them. Mrs. Catherine Dubois was a formidable woman in her 50s, dripping with jewelry and opinions. She swept into the workshop like a force of nature, took one look at Prudence and announced, "I was told the dresses were made by an Indian woman and a mountain man." Nobody mentioned a fat German girl. The workshop went silent. Willow's hands stilled on the beadwork she'd been finishing. Nathaniel, who'd been cutting leather at his workbench, straightened with dangerous calm. But Prudence surprised them all. She simply smiled, a cool, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "Then you were misinformed, Mrs. Dubois. The designs are mine, the leatherwork is primarily Nathaniel's, and the beading and detailed sewing is Willow's. We work as partners. If that troubles you, you're welcome to forfeit your deposit and leave without your commission." Mrs. Dubois' face flushed. "Now see here." "No, you see here," Prudence interrupted, her voice still calm but inflected with steel. "You can insult me all you like. I've had plenty of practice ignoring such things, but you'll treat my partners with respect, or you'll leave. Those are your options." For a long moment, Mrs. Dubois stared at her. Then, slowly, her expression changed. "You have backbone," she said finally. "I like that. Show me the dresses." The 3 dresses were exquisite, one for evening wear in cream-colored doeskin with intricate beadwork depicting prairie roses, one for day wear in soft brown leather with practical pockets and subtle fringe, and one for riding in darker leather with reinforced seams and innovative split construction that allowed movement while maintaining modesty. Mrs. Dubois examined each piece in silence, her fingers trailing over the workmanship with the appreciation of someone who understood quality. Finally, she said, "These are extraordinary, truly extraordinary. You've created something entirely new, practical enough for frontier life but elegant enough for society. I'll pay double the agreed price on one condition." "Which is?" Prudence asked warily. "That you make me 10 more dresses and allow me to display them in my husband's emporium in St. Louis, with your workshop's mark clearly visible. I believe you've created something that could change the way frontier women dress, and I want to be part of that." The deal they struck that day transformed everything. Mrs. Dubois became their champion and distributor, and within a year, orders were coming in faster than they could fill them. They hired more seamstresses, including several native women whose skills had previously been undervalued by the frontier economy. The workshop became a place where different cultures collaborated, where European tailoring met native artistry, where women who'd been told they were worthless discovered they had marketable skills. 2 years after the dance that changed everything, Nathaniel asked Prudence to marry him on another spring evening, in the same spot where they'd first confessed their feelings. This time, though, there was no nervousness, no uncertainty. They'd built something real together, not just a business, but a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine love. "I want to marry you in the dress," Nathaniel said as they planned their wedding. "The white doeskin from that first night. I want you to wear it and remember that you've always been beautiful, always been worthy, always been enough, not because I say so, but because it's true." The wedding was held in the timber church where Prudence had once been humiliated, but the space had been transformed by their community. Native blankets hung alongside European bunting. Wildflowers mingled with hothouse roses someone had shipped in at considerable expense. The guest list included everyone from Colonel Wickham, whose relationship with his daughter remained strained after her cruelty had come to light, to Running Bear, the Crow medicine man who'd taught Nathaniel leatherwork and who'd traveled 200 miles to attend. Prudence did wear the white doeskin dress, now carefully preserved, and still as beautiful as the night it had saved her. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she thought about the girl she'd been, frightened and ashamed, convinced her body made her unworthy of love or happiness. That girl seemed impossibly distant now. The ceremony was conducted by the fort's minister, with contributions from Running Bear, a blending of traditions that seemed appropriate for a couple whose entire relationship had been built on bridging worlds. When Nathaniel lifted her veil and kissed her, Prudence felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. The reception that followed was legendary. People danced until dawn, and stories were told that would be repeated for years. Mrs. Dubois, who'd traveled from St. Louis for the occasion, announced a new commission, 50 dresses to outfit the wives of railroad executives who were planning a journey west. Willow, resplendent in her own doeskin dress, danced with her French-Canadian husband and whispered to Prudence that she'd never seen two people more perfectly matched. But the moment Prudence treasured most came late in the evening when she and Nathaniel slipped away from the festivities for a quiet moment alone. They stood on the fort's wall, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. "Do you ever think about that night?" Nathaniel asked. "The dance, the ruined dress, all of it?" "Every day," Prudence admitted, "but not with pain anymore, with gratitude. Because if Sarah and her friends hadn't destroyed my dress, you might never have given me yours. We might never have talked. This might never have happened." Nathaniel pulled her close. "I like to think we'd have found our way to each other eventually. Some things are inevitable." "Maybe," Prudence said, "but I'm glad it happened the way it did. I'm glad for every moment, even the hard ones, because they led me here." 5 years into their marriage, Prudence and Nathaniel had expanded far beyond their original workshop. They now owned a building in St. Louis where skilled craftspeople created their designs, while the Fort Laramie location focused on custom work and teaching. They'd also opened a small school where young women, both native and settler, could learn leatherwork, sewing, and business skills. Their home, built halfway between the fort and Nathaniel's original mountain cabin, was filled with the sounds of life. 2 children, Emma, named for Nathaniel's first wife with Prudence's blessing, and Jacob, named for Prudence's grandfather, played in the workshop under Willow's watchful eye while their parents worked. Emma, at 3 years old, already showed signs of her mother's artistic eye and her father's practical nature. She would sit for hours watching Nathaniel work leather, then toddle over to Prudence's design table to add her own scribbled improvements to the sketches. Jacob, barely 1, was content to chew on leather scraps under strict supervision and gurgle happily at anyone who paid him attention. On the anniversary of that first dance, Prudence held a tradition she'd started the year after her wedding. She invited every young woman in the area who felt like an outsider, too tall, too short, too fat, too thin, too poor, too different, to the workshop. There, with help from Willow and a team of seamstresses, they would make each girl a dress that celebrated her exactly as she was. The girls would arrive shy and uncertain, convinced their bodies were wrong, that they didn't deserve beauty. They would leave standing straighter, smiling wider, carrying garments that had been made with love and the revolutionary idea that every body was worthy of celebration. One spring, a girl arrived who reminded Prudence painfully of herself, plump, scared, carrying the weight of 100 small cruelties. Her name was Alice, and she'd walked 10 miles from a neighboring settlement to attend after hearing stories about the workshop. "I heard you make magic here," Alice said softly, barely able to meet Prudence's eyes. Prudence smiled and took the girl's hand. "Not magic, honey, just truth. Come on, let me show you what I mean." As she worked with Alice, teaching her to take her own measurements without shame, to choose colors that made her happy rather than colors that might make her invisible, Prudence caught Nathaniel's eye across the workshop. He was working with Emma, teaching their daughter the proper way to cut leather, his hands gentle and patient. He looked up, caught her watching, and smiled. That same smile that had promised her she was worthy all those years ago. The white doeskin dress hung on the wall in a place of honor, preserved behind glass. It had become a symbol of their workshop, their marriage, their entire philosophy. That beauty comes in all forms, that cruelty can be overcome with kindness, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best. 20 years after the dance that changed everything, Prudence stood in the St. Louis Emporium that now served as the flagship location for Blackwood and Miller Leatherworks. The company had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. They now had locations in 5 cities, employed over 100 craftspeople, and their designs had influenced fashion across the frontier and beyond. But success hadn't changed the core mission. Every garment they made, from the simplest belt to the most elaborate dress, was created with the same philosophy: celebrate the wearer's body, blend artistry with practicality, and honor the diverse traditions that made frontier life rich and complex. Tonight, they were hosting an exhibition, 20 Years of Revolution in Leather, featuring pieces from their personal collection, including the white doeskin dress that had started it all. Prudence, now 42 and more comfortable in her skin than she'd ever imagined possible, moved through the crowd with easy confidence. Her hair, shot through with gray, was piled elegantly on her head. She wore a dress of deep brown leather with subtle beading in a pattern Emma had designed. Nathaniel, silver threading his dark hair and weathered by years in the sun, stood near the display of his earliest work. He still spent time in the mountains, still hunted and tanned leather with the same careful precision, but now he did it for joy rather than survival. Their children were grown. Emma, 23, ran their original Fort Laramie workshop with her husband, a Shoshone man she'd met through Willow's family. Jacob, 20, was studying business in Philadelphia but planned to return west to expand their operations into new territories. A third child, Rose, born late and unexpected when Prudence was 38, sat on a bench sketching the crowd with the focused intensity of a born artist. Willow, now in her 60s and still sharp as ever, sat beside Rose, offering quiet commentary and encouragement. She'd officially retired 2 years ago, but couldn't seem to stay away from the workshops. The evening's highlight came when a young woman approached Prudence with tears streaming down her face. She was perhaps 18, heavy-set, dressed in one of their designs. "Mrs. Blackwood," the girl said, her voice shaking, "I wanted to thank you. 2 years ago, I didn't want to live anymore. I'd spent my whole life being told my body was wrong, that I was ugly, that I'd never be worth anything. Then my aunt bought me one of your dresses, and for the first time in my life, I felt beautiful. Not in spite of how I looked, but just beautiful. It saved my life. Literally saved it. I wanted you to know that." Prudence embraced the girl, her own eyes filling with tears. "What's your name?" "Hannah. Hannah, listen to me. You were always beautiful, always worthy, always enough. The dress just helped you see what was already true." She pulled back and looked Hannah in the eyes. "Now, are you good with your hands? Because we're always looking for talented people to join our workshops." As the exhibition wound down and guests began departing, Nathaniel found Prudence standing alone in front of the glass case containing the white doe-skin dress. "What are you thinking?" he asked, sliding an arm around her waist. "I'm thinking about that terrified girl crying in a changing room, convinced her life was over because of a ruined dress and a lifetime of cruelty," Prudence said softly. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am to Sarah Wickham and her mean friends." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Grateful?" "Grateful. Because their cruelty led you to me. It sparked something that became this." She gestured at the exhibition, the evidence of 2 decades of work and love and purpose, something bigger than either of us could have created alone. They tried to destroy me, but instead they gave me wings. "That's very philosophical," Nathaniel teased, pulling her closer. "I'm old now," Prudence said with a laugh. "Old women are allowed to be philosophical." "You're not old. You're seasoned, like good leather, soft and supple and more beautiful with every year." "Did you just compare me to leather?" "It's the highest compliment I know how to give." Prudence laughed and kissed him, there in the gallery surrounded by 20 years of memories and dreams made real. The white doe-skin dress gleamed in its case, a reminder of the worst and best night of her life, of the moment when cruelty had met kindness and kindness had won. Outside, St. Louis bustled with evening traffic, carriages and pedestrians, gas lamps flickering to life as dusk fell. But inside the gallery, in that moment, Prudence felt the same peace she'd felt on their wedding day, the same sense of rightness and belonging. She'd built a life and a business on a simple revolutionary idea, that every person deserved to be celebrated exactly as they were. That beauty came in infinite forms, that the cruelty of small-minded people could be transformed into something powerful and lasting if you refused to let it define you. The white doe-skin dress had been a gift, not just of beautiful leather and skilled craftsmanship, but of dignity and hope at a moment when both seemed impossible. It had been the first stitch in a tapestry that would eventually stretch across a continent, touching thousands of lives. And it all started with a mountain man who saw worth where others saw weakness, who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier, who believed that beauty comes in all forms and that every person deserves someone who sees them truly. As Prudence and Nathaniel walked home through the gaslit streets, hand in hand as they'd been for 20 years, she thought about the message she'd want to leave for future generations. Your body is not wrong. You are not too much or too little. And anyone who tears you down is revealing their own emptiness, not yours. Find the people who celebrate you, build something beautiful with them, and never forget that sometimes the worst moments of your life are doorways to the best. The white doeskin dress, after all, had started as an act of malice, but love and skill had transformed it into something eternal, a symbol of resilience, beauty, and the revolutionary power of being seen. Would you like me to adjust the tone, add more detail to any particular section, or emphasize different themes in the story?